afternoon, everybody. We might make a start. Please come in if you're still having afternoon tea. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Pleased to chair this session, which involves the launch of a World Bank ANU report on labour mobility. It's being published as part of the Pacific Possible project of the World Banks, which will be explained to you very shortly. This is the report here. I'll let Venki introduce that project and Stephen discuss the report in detail. Before I introduce the speakers, though, I do want to take a moment to give my vote of thanks on behalf of the Development Policy Centre, which is one of the organising institutions for this conference. I want to thank the other organisers, the Asian Development Bank, Christopher Edmonds, Prince Cruz in particular, who I know has put a lot of effort into the organisation of this event, ADBI for their support, the second year in a row, and of course the University of the South Pacific. It's always wonderful to be back on campus here. It's the second year that we held the Pacific Update at USP. Prior to that, it was held at ANU for 2 years running, and it's always just fantastic to have it actually held in the region. So I'd like to thank the students and the staff from USP who were involved in the organisation of the conference, who have contributed to the program. And in particular, I want to single out Nilesh Gaunda, who has been the main organising person at USP. So thank you. I also want to take a moment to highlight a publication of the Development Policy Centre's, and that's this publication here. It's called Pacific Stories. It's available in the corridor outside, and we're launching it here at this conference. It basically is a collection of the best of the Development Policy Centre's blog posts or articles focused on the Pacific Islands region. It covers a range of issues affecting the region and includes contributions from very well-known academics, policymakers, and leaders from the Pacific. People like Aka Rimon, the Kiribati Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Meg Taylor, Joe Knuckleman, and also USP scholars such as Dornan. And I should just mention that I was involved in putting this together, but the other key person was Tessa Kane, which is sitting there in the middle. So please do take a copy. They're outside. They're also available online on our website. Turning to this session, though, I want to briefly introduce the two speakers. So speaking first will be Venki Sundaraman. He will be speaking about the Pacific Possible project under which this report has been produced, and he is the program leader for human development for the Pacific Islands region. You won't find him on your program, that's because he initially was not able to come, but fortunately his schedule cleared and he was able to make it. So thank you for coming along. I'll also introduce the person that will actually present the contents of the report. That is Stephen Howes, sitting over there. He's the director of the Development Policy Centre, where I work. He's had a long history in the development sector in Australia and in the Pacific. He's a former chief economist at AusAid and former lead economist of the World Bank in India. You'll see a few other names in the program for this session. Richard Curtin, who is a fellow at the Development Policy Centre, Jesse Doyle, a labour migration specialist at the World Bank, and my own name. So we were all involved in the writing of this report, but in the interest of time, we've decided that we'll just have Stephen present its contents. So on that note, I think I'll hand over to Venki.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. name is Venki Sundararaman. As Matt just said, I'm an economist with the World Bank based out of the Sydney office. So I'm going to take only 5 to 10 minutes and just give you an overview of what the specific possible is that Matt referred to. We started working on this about towards the start of 2015. And the reason why we started to do it, part of it is because we are a bureaucracy and we do have sort of institutional, instead of inertia, I'm going to use the word momentum. So we developed a program called China 2030 a few years ago, and then we did something called Vietnam 2035. So then it became obvious that the next in line should be a Pacific 2040, but we got a little bit more creative and we decided to call it the Pacific Possible instead of just being predictable. And the Pacific Possible, essentially the sort of the motivation for the Pacific Possible is based on that graph that's up there right now, which shows that if you look at average annual growth across those years that's specified, and you look at the far left of the picture, what you'll see are developing country EAP averages, so that's East Asia and Pacific. And then the next set of bars are small states. And then if you go further to the right, it's the Pacific average. And so the question really is, how do we help Pacific Island countries sort of, an earlier presentation talked about moving on to higher growth trajectories. That's essentially the question that we'd like to also try and answer. How do we get Pacific Island countries to move on to sort of higher growth trajectories than where they have found themselves in the last so many years? There are two issues here. One is the fact that we all recognize the economic geography constraints posed on Pacific Island countries, if you want to see them as constraints, which is that they tend to be small and they tend to be very remote. An earlier presentation compared, in fact, Matt and Stacy's paper compared the Caribbean and the Pacific. And they are both, you can classify them as small island developing states, but the fact is that the pics are truly unique in many, many ways given how remote some of these countries are and how dispersed some of these countries are. So is there anything that we can do that can help these countries move to the next sort of growth path? This is a simple sort of a secular increase in per capita incomes across these countries. If you just take sort of a business as usual scenario, and you look at the blue lines, which are 2013, and you look at the red lines, which are 2040, this is where you expect these countries to sort of be in 2040. Now, if you think about the sort of the rule of 70, so a country that grows at 1% per annum, will it double its income over a 70-year period? What we're looking at over here is that even small improvements to that 1% could help these countries. But look at, for example, Tonga. Tonga is roughly at about $4,000 per capita. And if you see what the expected amount is in 2040, not much beyond that. Can we do something that helps these countries move on to a different growth path and improve their opportunities? So we're not obviously the first ones to think about this. Everybody's thought about this. Everybody's thinking about it. Anyone who's interested in development as an area of specialization worries about this constantly. The PICs truly represent a unique challenge. I mean, when I only moved here about 18 months ago, and the first time they told me that I was moving to the Pacific region, I sat and looked at a map and I realized that one, these are very, very small countries, but if you sort of draw a dotted line, a line across all of those countries, you would suddenly come up with the world's largest country, right? That's how dispersed this region is. And so the challenges are absolutely enormous. So I think it was OSAID together with some other agencies that came up with a report called Pacific 2020. The World Bank worked on something called the Pacific Futures. And The OSCE report, and I'm sort of exaggerating, but suggested that if we could get all these countries to focus on governance and improve their governance, the PICS could be the next Singapore or the next Mauritius. The World Bank report came out and said, well, maybe not really. There are still constraints that they'll have a very hard time overcoming. And maybe long-term aid dependence is something that we should take for granted with a lot of these countries. So what the Pacific Possible does is it tries to identify a narrow set of opportunities that we believe can be the areas that fuel the growth for the region. And so we look at 6. I'm going to skip through this. I'm just going to go straight to the 6 possibilities that we're looking at. We look at six key themes as part of this effort. First is called Harnessing the Riches of the Ocean, and there are 2 papers that fall under that. Then we're looking at labor mobility, which is the paper that's going to be presented to you later today. We're looking at tourism, so we call it Host to the World, and we're looking at tourism. We're looking at knowledge and ICT connectivity in the region, and what does that do for sort of helping the Pacific Islands sort of integrate better into the rest of the world. We looked at something called working together. So are there things that can be done that can be done collectively that helps the countries sort of have a I'll come back to that issue. Sorry. Managing increasing stress, we were looking at 2 areas. They were looking at not the impacts of non-communicable diseases, and we're looking at the impacts of climate change. So on the 2 over there at the top, impacts of climate change and non-communicable diseases, we're looking at the cost that those 2 issues impose on the Pacific Island countries. The rest of them, if you want to think about them, they're sort of cash registers. They're additions to cash registers, to these countries' cash registers. For example, if you can improve your fisheries revenues, so that's what the first paper would do. That would add to the country's income. Whereas if you look at the impacts of non-communicable disease and the cost that imposes on these countries, that's a deduction from the income. So we're looking at 4 or 5 areas that contribute to income, and 2 areas where if you do not manage the costs, they're going to spiral out of control, right? So that's it. The working together issue was, are there economies of scale that can be obtained by these countries getting together? So let's take an area of pharmaceutical procurement. Can countries get together and procure the pharmaceutical needs for their countries in such a way that it reduces the cost to these countries? And I have to say that we looked at that closely, and we've almost come to a conclusion that that really doesn't help, and we're not able to specifically say whether it's because of data issues or whether it's because of how we've modeled it, but we find that the procurement, the collective procurement part of it, of say pharmaceutical inputs, is not panning out as we had initially hoped. But all the other papers do add. On the harnessing the riches of the Pacific Ocean, we also look at another area which is highly controversial, which is on deep sea mining. On the deep sea mining paper, what we are doing is we're not taking an advocacy role. We're basically doing a stock take of this issue. You'll read from these reports that from this particular report that a lot of the countries in this region are already thinking about deep sea mining. They have policies on it, or they're working on policies towards deep sea mining. But we are looking at this and saying, well, maybe we need to take a step back. Maybe we need to understand what are the costs and the risks that this imposes on these countries. what are the sort of the interaction effects that this could have with say, their fishery stocks or tuna stocks. And so we've taken the paper that we've prepared till now takes a sort of puts forward the idea of taking a precautionary approach, which is a sort of a standard approach looking at these kinds of issues. So we push precautionary principle approaches, and let me just go into some of these. Like I said, the harnessing the riches of the Pacific Ocean consists of those two papers on deep sea mining and specifically on tuna fisheries. Managing increasing stress looks at the impact that non-communicable diseases will have on the region. The Pacific Island countries are already dealing with a very, very high burden of non-communicable diseases. And if that is left untouched or is not dealt with, it's going to impose incredible costs on these governments. Labor mobility, you're going to find out, I'm not going to say anything about that paper, but you're going to find out from Jesse and Stephen what the results of that paper are. And as I said, on ICT, the real issue is what can ICT do for the region? How does connectivity improve economic opportunities for Pacific Islanders? Is there a way for Pacific Islanders to tap into markets that are far beyond their shores and participate in what is known as the sort of the emerging economies, trends that are, in terms of app development, in terms of looking at access to sort of looking at opportunities that are provided by looking at opportunities that are provided by come back to that, sorry, very sorry. Can't continue. I'll stop here. Sorry.
All right, so Pinky's told you about Pacific Possible as a project. We're going to focus in on the labour mobility part. But just to give you a little break, here's a video on video.
Constant ongoing learning process. I think that's the most enjoyable thing about it. I'm from Udivas. Life in Udivas, it's fun. You don't care about time. It's just smooth as, it's like the waves. You go fishing and you live in Makan. It's like a society where it's just family. So it's like a clan. You're never wrong. There's only 8 Udivas people living in England. In Australia, the thing is, you get these really red-hot opportunities, you get paid well and all that. The downside is you just feel isolated because it's a big place. I've got my son at home at the moment, his mom, so try to support him the best I can. He's turning 9 in July. Whenever I'm settled, I always go get him, bring him over.
Okay. So we'll just load up the next presentation. Yeah, so this is Pacific Possible Labour Mobility Report, and it examines what is possible through overseas employment for Pacific Islanders. It's a collaborative project that we've done at the ANU with the World Bank. It's authored by the four of us. We're all here today, except for Richard Curtin. It's a big report, and I can only give you a taste of it in my presentation this afternoon, because it combines a lot of new research. It then uses that research to formulate new policy recommendations, and then it quantifies the benefits and impacts of those policy recommendations through this scenario analysis. This version we put out today, although it looks glossy, it's not the final version, it is a draft, so we certainly welcome your comments and feedback. Well, why look at labour mobility? That's the first question to deal with. And in fact, I was involved in Pacific 2020, and even then we were highlighting the importance of labour mobility. And I think since then, over the last decade, there is now broad consensus that expanding labour mobility is vital for the future of the Pacific. And it's not only for the Kiribati and Tuvalu, right, where you just saw in the video. We heard this morning how remittances are the second largest source of foreign exchange earnings, even in a relatively sophisticated economy such as Fiji. So for all of the Pacific Island countries, for a variety of reasons, expanding labour mobility is crucial. And if we have to summarise it in one thing, it's there aren't enough jobs. That's a common refrain that you hear. And when you can't create enough jobs at home, it makes sense to start thinking about taking people to where the jobs are. And the Pacific's fortunate to be surrounded by large metropolitan countries, many of which have a tradition of taking in a large number of migrants. So we argue that labour mobility provides a triple win for the migrant, the sending country, and the receiving country. I think for the migrant, the benefits of labour mobility are so obvious, and that's why so many people want to migrate. There just aren't enough jobs at home, and the opportunity to work abroad can result in significant income gains and a significantly higher standard of living. So I think that's pretty obvious. What about for the sending country? Well, it's true, no country has ever become prosperous on the back of a labour mobility strategy, so we shouldn't think this is going to make the Pacific rich. But nevertheless, it is going to make a significant contribution to the development of the Pacific. Primarily through remittances that are sent home. Remittances reduce poverty in sending countries, support human capital development, help finance trade deficit. Sending countries are often worried about the brain drain, especially the smaller countries, but we argue in the report that we must and we can have labour mobility without brain drain, and I'll come back to that later on. Finally, what's in it for the receiving countries? This is probably the most interesting part of the equation, and perhaps the most important. Migration's, always a controversial subject, and perhaps especially so these days. But as I said, these countries like Australia, New Zealand, the US are built on migration. And they know that migrants plug labour shortages, and our research shows that Pacific migrants generally do well abroad and are able to get jobs and hold them down. Australia and New Zealand are very focused on the Pacific region, but a strategy that is dominated by aid is an unbalanced strategy. And while aid's important, there are many things that it can't do that labour mobility can. When we think about getting benefits direct to the household, when we think about jobs, when we think about knowledge transfer, we want to think not about aid, but about labour mobility. It's often seen to be quite controversial to suggest preferential treatment in any country's migration program, but it's a myth that countries have non-discriminatory migration programs. All countries give preferential treatment to particular countries in their migration program. And if you think about Australia, we have a special relationship with New Zealand, but we also have the largest backpacker scheme in the world, which is almost exclusively, I'll come back to it in a minute, but it's almost exclusively oriented or open to other developed countries. And we argue that preferential treatment for the Pacific balances this, is justified on strategic ground, and is manageable given the small numbers involved. Particularly for Australia, the final point we make is that, Australia, we like to think we have a skills-oriented migration program, points-based, but increasingly we're using migration to fill low-skill requirements. But we're doing that in a very informal way through backpacker and student visas. And that's leading to a culture of exploitation, which has recently been unearthed through a series of investigations. So we argue that the Pacific Labour Mobility Strategy would help, especially Australia, improve the way it meets its low-skilled labour requirements. All right, so it's a great thing. How's it going? What are the opportunities out there? Well, labour mobility opportunities are very unevenly divided across the Pacific. The report only covers these 10 countries because it only covers, you've got to be a World Bank member to be in the report. But you can see how these 4 categories would cover all the Pacific Island countries. First of all, we have the open access countries. You could also put Cook Islands here. These are countries that have a formal arrangement whereby all their citizens have the right to move to another country. And so, not surprisingly, they have very high migration rates. The second group are the high mobility countries. These are ones that don't have formal free access, but through history, through some special limited arrangements, through having a diaspora abroad, they become high mobility economies. And so some of them have even higher migration rates than the open access economies. Then right next to them, at the opposite extreme, you have PNG, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. These are some of the most isolated countries in the world in terms of the movement of people. Very limited access in terms of labour mobility. And then finally, we highlight these 2 atoll countries. These are not the only atoll countries in the Pacific, but they're 2 that don't have that open access. Right? And so they don't have that safety net, but they are facing very real risks from climate change. So the reforms we suggest will benefit all countries, but we're particularly interested in how we can increase access for the low mobility countries and the atolls. Then looking at it from a receiving country point of view, and we try to look at it from both points of view, these are the 3 main receiving countries. And because they're such large countries, Pacific's relatively small, the stock of Pacific migrants is tiny. Even in New Zealand, it's only 3% of the population. All right, so it's a good thing. We want more of it, especially better distributed. How are we going to achieve it? We don't think there's a magic bullet. Right? We're not convinced there's going to be a Pacific community like the EU, and there's going to be open, free access to people across all the borders. Maybe a long way away, but that's not a practical reform option. So what we're interested in is more a variety of approaches, what we call a menu of options. And we put ideas out there that not everyone's going to agree with, but they're options for policymakers to consider. The aim of this report is very much to provoke discussion and debate. Right? It's to let 1,000 flowers bloom. We focus on both the sending and the receiving countries. We try to address the concerns of both. In terms of the receiving countries, we mainly focus on Australia and New Zealand, but we also examine one South Korean scheme. And as I said, on the sending countries, we're focusing on the low mobility and those 2 atoll nations. As I said, we take a menu approach. We categorise the options that we put forward under these 3 categories of seasonal, less than 12 months, temporary, 1 to 5 years, and long-term, 5 years or permanent. And we're mainly focusing on, we are focused on low and medium skilled. If you're a doctor, you can already migrate under the points-based system. We're interested in pathways for those unable to reach them at the moment. And as I said, this is based on a lot of new research that we'll be bringing out in a series of papers based on study of existing schemes and related issues. All right, I'm going to go through first by the receiving country reforms, seasonal, temporary, permanent, and then go on to what the sending countries need to do. So if we think about seasonal work, the 2 big schemes are the Australian Seasonal Worker Program and the New Zealand Recognised Seasonal Employer Program. And when we think about these programs from a reform point of view, we have to think about them in very different ways because they're very different schemes. The New Zealand scheme is much bigger. It has been for some time, but it's capped. So if you're thinking about a policy reform for New Zealand, then it's going to be to increase the cap. And the New Zealand government does that from time to time. Of course, it's always a sensitive issue because it is a very popular scheme. But given their aspirations and the potential of the horticultural sector, its aim of doubling the size of the sector by 2020, it seems to be a very good reform to consider. In the case of Australia, it's a much smaller scheme, but there is no cap. Right? The scheme was uncapped, I think, just either this year or perhaps last year. So it's an issue. The good news about the scheme is that it is growing, some 500 to 1,000 new entrants every year on a net basis. And the issue for this scheme is what are the reforms we can do to increase that pace of growth. And we have several reforms, but the main ones I highlight here. The first is this point that we made before, to remove the second-year visa extension for backpackers. Currently, if backpackers work on a farm for 3 months, they can get a second-year visa. So you are funneling these backpackers who can work anywhere. You're funneling them into the horticultural sector. About 40,000 do a year. They're completely out-competing the seasonal workers because it's an unregulated and much more flexible scheme. This is a reform that predates the seasonal worker program. And now that the government has a seasonal worker program, is no longer warranted. If it's too controversial to remove that extension, then just make it available for any 3 months of work, rather than funneling people directly into horticulture. Second, we still think the scheme could be much better promoted. We hope that will happen after the elections. Third, there's been, we all know the stories of illegal labour. Sometimes it affects seasonal workers, but the seasonal workers are relatively well treated. Right? It's really the backpackers and illegal migrants that are caught up in this illegal labour. And I think it's become much clearer now what needs to be done as a result of a couple of parliamentary inquiries. It's really the labour hire companies at the heart of this. They're a mixed bag, but it's not a regulated sector. Anyone can set up as a labour hire company. And so you get those shonky businesses. I think if we regulated labour hire, as several other countries do, we would make a lot of progress cracking down on illegal labour, levelling the playing field for the seasonal worker program. So that's on seasonal work. On temporary migration, 1 to 5 years, we have a number of proposals and schemes that we put forward for consideration. There are 4, so let me run through them. First of all, we talk about Pacific backpackers. As I mentioned, Australia is the mecca for backpackers. It attracts about half of all backpackers in the world. Backpacker visas are increasingly employment rather than tourism or cultural exchange visas if you look at the statistics. 95% of backpackers coming to Australia come from developed countries, but there are a small number of capped places available for a number of developing countries. And discussions are underway between Australia and PNG and Fiji to give these 2 countries that same access. And we think that's a great initiative, and we think we should all the best and hope it's generalised to other Pacific Island countries. Because let's say, even if it was only 100, you would be giving 100 young people the opportunity to work in Australia for 2 years. These are not your leading experts. These are people who are fresh entrants into the labour market. And we know that a significant number of those who go on to get longer-term visas start out as backpackers. So once you're in Australia working, you have many more opportunities to get additional work and to extend your visa under different categories. So that's Pacific backpackers. Second schemes is one I mentioned from Korea. Korea has something called the employment permit system, which provides work visas for up to 55,000 unskilled young workers for up to 5 years. And Timor-Leste is one of 15 Asian countries that has signed up to this scheme. And it's in fact sent 1,900 workers there, many, many more, an order of magnitude more than sent to Australia under the seasonal worker program. Most are still there, but we, as part of this research, we surveyed 30 workers who returned to Timor from Korea. And what they told us is they found work pretty hard in Korea, but they were generally very positive about their time there. They felt they learnt a lot, and they earned a lot of money. Half of them sent home $6,000 or more a year. So on the basis of this positive experience, our recommendation is to the Pacific to lobby Korea, who is increasingly interested in the Pacific, to extend this Asian scheme to include the Pacific. But it's not just a matter of lobbying. The work of the sending country government is critical in all this. And to be concrete, in this case of this scheme, you have to pass a Korean language test. And obviously that's something that the sending country government needs to support in terms of training. All right, the third area that we look at is what can be done to help Pacific Islanders access existing temporary skilled migration programs. For example, 457 in Australia and New Zealand's essential skills visa. Right? These already exist. There's nothing stopping Pacific Islanders coming under them. Why aren't they coming in more numbers? And we have a long discussion in the report about this. But for the purpose of the presentation, I want to zero in on APTC because we think that's crucial to answering this question. So the Australia Pacific Technical College, which is actually headquartered here in Suva, was set up in 2006, 2007 as a very innovative aid for migration initiative. You know, we often talk about aid for trade. This is a very similar concept, but applied to labour mobility. It was set up not only to provide skills, but to promote labour mobility. But unfortunately, it hasn't delivered on that labour mobility objective. And you can see from this graph that although many APTC students are interested in migrating, only a very small fraction of students, when you trace them after they've graduated, are actually successful in moving. APTC is being extended. It's going to go into a new phase, and that provides an opportunity to reinvigorate this labour mobility objective. And what we, to boil it down, what we argue is that the key requirement is to identify feasible migration pathways to specific countries. It's not enough just to provide a training program. Right? You have to provide the training, the employer links, perhaps some work experience in Australia, but based on that if you do this, there's no guarantee, but there's a reasonable chance that you will end up with a visa to a specific country. The way to avoid brain drain in all this, and that's always been a sensitivity around APTC, is either by training fresh students and or picking up occupations where there's not a domestic shortage. The final temporary migration proposal that we argue for is what we call the Specific High Medical Need Caregivers Program. You know, aged care is it's not just a growth industry, right? It's an exploding industry in Australia as the community ages, and then sadly, you know, older people tend to be less healthy. So the requirements are going to more than double over the next 30 years. Now, Australia is very heavily reliant on migrants in the aged care sector if you look at the data, but we don't have a formal migration route because you can't qualify. If you're an aged care worker, you don't qualify under 457. So we tend to pick up students, backpackers, spouses to fill these jobs. That is spouses and migrants. New Zealand does have a migration route, and in fact a number of Pacific Islanders have migrated to New Zealand as aged care workers. But it only has, that's because New Zealand has a lower skills threshold, but it only allows these workers in for 1 year. And obviously if you're caring for someone who's unwell, you know, you don't want to just come for a year and go. So we need a system which has much less churn and more stability for higher quality care. And we've looked into what Canada does. Canada has a multi-year caregiver visa for in-home care to people with high medical needs. And we recommend Australia and New Zealand adopt something like this, but with a focus on the Pacific, not just because of our Pacific bias, but because we think with that geographical focus, Australia and New Zealand could have much more influence over things like educational qualifications and providing some Australian work experience. All right, so those are the four temporary migration programs, and we now go on to the long term. I'm not going to talk again about how to make better use of existing skills schemes, because I've already covered that under the discussion of APTC. But we do look at these New Zealand specific category visa. These are visas for select Pacific Island countries that work on a lottery basis, as I'm sure many of you know. And this selection by lottery, because you get this massive excess demand for these schemes, that avoids brain drain. Because it's not the most skilled who are selected, right? It's the lucky who are selected. But then, once you're selected, you've got, I think it's 6 months to get a job. And that's also a really good idea, because that supports good migration outcomes. Right? It makes it less likely that you're going to come to New Zealand and be unemployed. So overall, our analysis is that these schemes deliver good migration outcomes, you know, without requiring the sort of micromanagement that characterises a scheme like the Seasonal Worker Program. And so on this basis, we argue for the expansion of the scheme to Australia, but with two reforms. You know, one, at the moment, all you have to do is pass an English language test, and we know that if you've got better education outcomes, you'll do better in New Zealand. So we're not talking about university qualifications, but something like Year 10 or Year 12. I think that would be a sensible reform. And second, we advocate more job brokerage assistance to ensure better quality jobs first time round, help people get on a path to prosperity once they arrive. And then finally, this goes back to the video really, and this is perhaps the most radical idea in the report, but I think a very important and interesting one, which is the idea of an Australia-New Zealand atoll access agreement. I mean, countries are very reluctant to give another country free access, right, to their nation, but they do it under special circumstances. They have a deep relationship with New Zealand, or if you think about the compact countries with the US. And the argument here is that climate change is that kind of very unique factor that would justify this kind of open access agreement. Kiribati and Tuvalu clearly face very high climate change risks, and they have limited labour mobility options. And in particular, Kiribati, if you look at their population projection, and that's based on current out-migration trends, right? We're going to see a doubling of migration over the next 30 to 40 years. They need to double their migration outflow just to stabilise their population. So we're not talking about depopulating these countries, but we're talking about reducing the increase in population in the face of these climate change risks. If Australia and New Zealand did provide this open access, it's not that everyone's going to leave on the next available flight. We know from the experience of the compact countries, we know because of income constraints, that the numbers would be more around the 1,500 mark, or 1,300 as our estimate. So very small and manageable in the context of overall migration numbers. All right, those are the range, the menu of receiving country reforms that we put on the table. Let me now go to the sending country. What do the sending countries need to do? And here, we highlight three things: skills, promotion, and social impact. So the most important of these is skills, and it's a very simple message, but a very important one. I mean, if you're worried about employment at home or abroad, and certainly if you're worried about the brain drain, you really want to focus on skills. And we don't mean here only technical vocational skills, we're also talking about lifting quality of school education to improve basic literacy and numeracy. Labour mobility does not have to lead to brain drain. And we've seen that it can in fact provide incentives for education and skills acquisition. But it's often government action that's needed to allow those incentives to actually be operationalised by enabling people to get the education they want. So the first is skills. Second is promotion of Pacific workers and opportunities. Labour mobility is a very private sector phenomenon. It's individuals who migrate. But for these sort of regulated, tailored schemes, whether it's backpackers, the career employment permit scheme, seasonal workers, governments do have a very important facilitating role. Whether it's MOUs, whether it's arranging workers, whether it's ensuring they're within your quota, passing the language test. Governments have a key facilitating role. And that also goes for promotion. You can advertise all you want, but the best form of promotion is good performance. And that's not only workers, that's again governments delivering workers on time and with minimum hassle. So this is mainly a challenge for national governments, but we do think there is a role for the region and for a regional body to seek out and promote labour mobility in the Pacific and to promote the Pacific to the rest of the world. And we zero in on Pacific Islands trade and invest. Given how important remittances are for the Pacific, why would you focus only on trade and investment, and why not also focus on work? So this is perhaps a broader mandate that the Pacific Islands trade and invest could take on. Finally, there's the issue of social impacts. A lot of people raise this when you talk about labour mobility. It's important to remember the social impacts of labour mobility need not be negative. In fact, we can think of many positive impacts through positive education outcomes and investments in community assets. Negative outcomes are most likely to arise from long-term family separations, right? When you've got one spouse going overseas for 5 years and the other spouse and dependents remaining at home. And so I think the most important thing you can do to avoid these negative social impacts is not promote those schemes that involve long-term separations of people that are likely to have dependents. And so in fact, none of the schemes in our report fall into that trap. All right, so what does it all mean? What does it add up to? Right? An important part of the Pacific Possible project is to try to quantify the benefits of some of these reforms. So in the case of labour mobility, we set out 3 scenarios out to 2040. The business as usual scenario under current policy, a medium growth scenario, and a high growth scenario. So in the medium growth scenario, we're doubling non-seasonal migration flows, and we're increasing seasonal workers by a half. And in the high growth, we're tripling non-seasonal migration flows, and we're doubling seasonal workers. And we're focusing these growth in both cases on those low mobility and atoll states. Now, how do we come up with these numbers? Well, you'll have to read the report, but basically we assess that if you partially implemented the reforms we're recommending, so you don't take all of them, but some good proportion, a partial implementation, then you will get to the medium growth scenario. And if you take most of what we're saying, then you'll achieve the high growth scenario. So there's tripling of non-seasonal and doubling of seasonal workers. So these are the two scenarios that we look at, and what do the results show? So these graphs are a little bit complicated, but they basically divide up countries into those four groupings that I mentioned. And they compare 2013 with 2040 under the three scenarios. So and the first good news is that even under business as usual, labour mobility is on a positive trend, right? So we are seeing positive growth, but it's only a small growth from 400 to 500,000. I think unfortunately, for some bizarre reason, that you cannot see the high growth. You can hardly see the high growth. So that's your PowerPoint, right? But I'll just have to talk you through it. This is the medium growth, is that red line. So that adds another 100,000, and the high growth adds another 100,000, takes you up to almost 800,000. So in terms of increment, you're kind of doubling under the medium growth, and then you've got another 100,000 under the high growth. What does that mean in terms of net income? So this is the income of Pacific migrants relative, the income of the migrants minus the opportunity cost, because they're not working at home. Again, the good news is that under business as usual, we've got a significant increase. So this is a positive trend for the Pacific. And that reflects the fact that once you migrate, you're going to benefit from OECD increases in average income, and you're on that treadmill of prosperity. So your income will go up more than the growth in income will be greater than the growth in migration. But again, you'll get a significant increase of about 5 billion more with the medium growth and 10 billion increase with the high growth. So this is what we call the $10 billion prize. That's how we characterize labour mobility reform. And importantly, what you can see here is the big increase, the tripling in net income for the low mobility countries, right? And you see a particularly large increase in atolls. You can't see that clearly on this graph, but I'll come back to it and show you shortly. Remittances also benefit enormously, and you get an additional $800 million in remittances from these reforms. Perhaps just look at this graph, and in fact you could just look at the wording. We define this GNI plus to be gross national income plus the net income of migrants as a measure of the aggregate benefit of labour mobility to the Pacific. And this has 2013 equal to 1, and then the BAU, the medium, and the high growth scenario. And you can see in the countries that we're focused on, massive increases. So in the high growth scenario, national income growth, including the net income from migrants, national income growth per capita doubles relative to business as usual for PNG and Solomon Islands. It triples for Vanuatu, and it quintuples, increases fivefold for Kiribati. These are, you can't get these numbers normally from the kind of reform analysis, right? These are extraordinary numbers, and it just shows what benefits there are to be had from pursuing labour mobility. In terms of what it means for the receiving countries, well, we'd hardly notice. Right? Because the Pacific numbers are small, the share of Pacific migration in Australia would finally reach 1%. It would be more significant for New Zealand, but it would still be 6%, only 6% of the population. All right, so to conclude, labour mobility reform is a $10 billion prize for the Pacific. And the good thing about it sounds too good to be true, but it is win-win. It's not like aid, where if one country gets more aid, another country is losing. That is the giving country, right? It's a prize that benefits the, that should be the sending countries as well. And just to put it in historical context, we have come a long way in the last decade when it comes to labour mobility. I talked about that actually the last Pacific update. with new initiatives like the Seasonal Work Program and the RSE program. And there's no reason why the next decade can't continue this momentum and end the phenomenon of isolation, which still afflicts some parts of the Pacific. But it does take two to tango, and it's a mistake to think that either sending countries can do this by themselves or the receiving countries. They both have a very important role to play. So as I said, this is a draft. You've got 6 weeks to provide feedback. There are a few copies outside, or downloaded from the Pacific Hospital website or the Development Policy Centre website. Send your comments to us. We'll post them on the Pacific Hospital website. And also look forward to the final Pacific Hospital report that's going to bring together all these individual reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We don't have very long for questions, but we will give you an opportunity to ask the panel. So can everyone please sit over there, and if we can get the roving mics ready. We'll take a few questions just in the interest of time, because we really only have maybe 6 or 7 minutes. So please raise your hand if you do have a question.
Thank you, Kirsten Johnson from the FSM. I'm now in private as a special climate change and sustainable development project manager for the Ajula Foundation in Guam. I wanted to ask you to expound more on how we can avoid having brain drain. And I'm speaking from experience. And tomorrow I will be speaking briefly on how to reverse the trend. As you know, unlike the Australia and New Zealand schemes on labor mobility, the US, as you pointed out correctly, has this open policy on movement, migration of citizens from the FAS, free associated state with the US. So anyone can migrate. And as you know, because of the proximity of FSM as well as the two other FAS government, $100 will take them from their other islands, their atolls. And there are no line islands to Guam, as a U.S. territory, or even to the state of Hawaii and to the continental U.S. I'd like to also get your feedback on how this can be done. Because we're struggling with it, and it is not, near the point that we're hoping we can achieve. There is actually, as you pointed to, nearly 30 to 40% of the population is out of the country. And as I said at the outset, this is a combination of low educated and highly educated citizens traveling to the U.S. territory of Guam, between CNMI, Hawaii, and the continental U.S. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we had a question over here.
My question is for Stephen Howes. So thank you for an excellent presentation, very clearly setting out some of the benefits of labour mobility and some clear reform initiatives for making labour mobility happen. My understanding is that as part of the PACER Plus trade negotiations between Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Island countries, the parties have agreed in principle to have an annual Pacific Labour Mobility meeting, a Pacific Labour Mobility annual meeting, to enhance the existing labour mobility schemes in Australia and New Zealand, to promote new areas of labour mobility, to strengthen the regulatory frameworks around labour mobility, to consider new training opportunities, and to consider issues around mutual recognition of qualifications. Now my question is, Stephen, you said that it takes two to tango, and I'm wondering if this idea of an annual Pacific labour mobility meeting is an appropriate dance floor for the two to tango? Does it provide a space to consider the reforms that you suggest on an ongoing basis, for the labour departments to consider the issues involved in sending and receiving countries? And I suppose the last question is, if there is this in principle agreement for an annual meeting, do you think it need be linked with the PACER Plus trade negotiations, or should it just happen anyway?
Okay, thank you. And I believe there was a question behind. Is that correct?
Sorry, I'm no expert in this field, and my interest in this is really quite fleeting, but you talk about a 10 billion prize in the Pacific, or for the Pacific. How equitable a prize is it? What of the prize for Australia and New Zealand? And to what extent do these schemes take into consideration issues on labour rights, etc., of workers who do go to Australia and New Zealand on these schemes?
Thank you very much. And we might just take a fourth question. This will be our last round, so your last opportunity to ask a question. Any hands? Just here, please.
The question is, Stephen, apart from remittances, what else? I guess we've had, this morning we talked about agriculture, we talked about tourism. The Pacific needs a lot of help in agriculture. How else, apart from remittances, could we utilize Australia and New Zealand's comparative advantage with agriculture to use those returning workers that come back to the region? I guess the narrative that you pointed out is quite familiar. I think all countries allow the labour mobility, but we're looking for other options as well.
All right, thank you very much. So 4 excellent questions. In fact, I think two of the people that asked questions actually asked 2 questions, so more than 4 questions. Stephen can start off, and then I'll give Jesse and Rinky an opportunity to comment on those questions also.
Okay, well, thank you. They are all excellent questions. On brain drain, I think different people have different approaches to this, but the way I look at brain drain is that it's a risk rather than an inevitability. And brain drain becomes an inevitability if you think that the stock of skills is fixed, and then anyone leaving therefore depletes that stock of skills. But I mean, that's a fallacy in the same way that thinking the stock of jobs is fixed, and so that any migrant is stealing a job when they arrive. Labour mobility can increase the incentives for people to go and get skills, and governments can also help to enhance the stock of skills. That's what I was talking about through their education and training programs. I mean, I think it's true that the open access agreements that the compact states have, probably do the least of all migration schemes to increase those incentives, because you can migrate anyway. Right? There are no minimum requirements. So I can see that how you respond to that is going to be a challenge. By the same token, the open access is not it's not a point system. It's not where only doctors can migrate. Right? Anyone who wants to can go. And I'm yet to meet anyone from a compact state or from, say, Cook Islands who wants to give up open access. So even when there are these trade-offs, I think we see the benefits of labour mobility outweigh the costs. In terms of Wesley's point, I mean, that's a very good point. There is this conference scheduled, as I understand, it's a New Zealand initiative, and the first conference is going to be in New Zealand this year, later this year, right? And it's, as I understand, it's not actually waiting for the conclusion of PACER Plus, which remains an uncertain prospect. But whatever you think of PACER Plus, it has had this great benefit that it's put labour mobility on the agenda, and or helped put it further on the agenda. And there's a whole raft of new initiatives, whether we look at Australia's reforms, the seasonal worker program, the new sectors it's being opened up to, the micro-states visa Australia's introduced, which is a temporary work visa for Kiribati, Tuvalu and Nauru. I saw in the paper yesterday, Fiji is advertising for carpenters under the Christchurch Reconstruction Labour Mobility Initiative. So there's a whole raft of new labour mobility initiatives coming about, I think in part because of the pressures that other countries have been putting through Basic Plus negotiations, through that dialogue. And so I think that answers the question, Wesley. This is going to be a very beneficial opportunity for countries to advance the labour mobility agenda. And it's great that it's happening, and great that it's not being held hostage to actual conclusion of the Basic Plus initiative. So, while some of the ideas that we presented might seem far-fetched today, let's not forget that in 2006, Australia rejected having a seasonal worker program. And the same government that rejected that program is now fully supportive of the program. So attitudes do change, and I think there is a shift in thinking on labour mobility. In terms of the $10 billion and who gets that, we did try to do some of that modelling. It's very difficult with the data on remittances is very bad, so it's very hard to actually do that in a good way. But given that we're not looking at, again, to go back to the doctors, we're not looking at more doctors going at the high-paid professionals, we're looking at opportunities for low-skilled and semi-skilled migration. So we think actually the opportunities would be quite equitably distributed.
We should be concerned about the data that we have suggests that it is. For a country like Kiribati that has a formal sector workforce of 28 to 30,000 people, and only 4 to 5% of those have post-school qualifications. If you have hundreds leaving, I think it is a concern. But the policy response shouldn't be to cut off pathways to migration. It's about how you manage brain drain and how you ensure that it's not sending countries that are bearing the cost for training up workers only to have them leave. So there's a couple of things that we explored in the paper. One is around these sort of global skills partnerships like APTC, where you basically have the receiving countries who are funding the training, and another's income contingent loan schemes. So you provide a means for students to take out loans, and if they decide to emigrate, then they have to repay those loans. On Wes's question with regards to the Pacific Labour Mobility Annual Meeting, is it the right dance floor? That's a good question. It's essentially the only dance floor that we have at the moment, because the Pacific Island Labour Sending Countries Forum is now being discontinued. There's no more funding for that. So PLAN is essentially all there is. So I think we have to make it the right dance floor. Just quickly on the question of whether the gains are being evenly distributed. As Stephen said, it's kind of difficult to quantify the gains for receiving countries, but certainly for the migrants, they capture a significant proportion of that $10 billion. And there's also a fairly sizable amount that's sent back to the sending countries. Around $800 million of that $10 billion is sent back. So I think it's a split. It's very difficult to say specifically what the impacts are for receiving countries, but I think further research needs to be done there.
I think every time this phrase brain drain is used, I almost feel I'm taking it personally right now, based on what happened. Listen, I'm sorry about that. I sort of lost track of what I was trying to say. Let me use the brain drain example and use it with the discussion that I was about to make on ICTs. If you think about the countries that have suddenly emerged in the world over the last 20 years as ICT powerhouses, if you think about the Philippines, if you think about India, if you think about Mauritius, these countries emerged as ICT powerhouses not because they're incredibly well connected, and not because they had very high levels of tertiary graduates with nothing to do. That's, to some extent, that's part of the story. But the fact is that there was a diaspora that went out. That diaspora went out and then came back and reinvested. If you look at some of the reports that came out from corporate houses, BCG, others, that said that China will be the next ICT sort of powerhouse by 2006. it hasn't materialized. And part of the reason for that, you could say language was one of the reasons, but another reason is that diaspora simply didn't go back. Whereas in the context of many countries, such as India, such as the Philippines, that group that had gone out, that would have constituted that initial brain drain that we're all discussing, did go back and invest. And so one must look at it from, it's not a zero-sum game. I think Stephen said that if just because they're leaving doesn't mean that it's a loss of skills, and just because somebody's taking a job somewhere else doesn't mean you're taking the job that belonged to somebody else in that country. There is labor mobility clearly has benefits, and you can see it in sectors such as, especially in sectors such as ICT, where you increasingly have, if you look at countries such as Kenya, South Africa, now emerging as centers for ICT development, it's all because of the diaspora that had left and that has now come back. So I think that's how one should perhaps think of brain drain, even though in small island developing states it might be the constraints might be very, very different as you're saying. And I think going to the question from up there in terms of in terms of how do we get more how do we get them to come back and invest and use the skills and knowledge that they acquired elsewhere? It's really a question of whether the policy environment is right to establish such areas of growth. So if the government of India hadn't invested in tertiary level education early on, then the chances of being able to use some of these resources when people came back would have been very limited. So I think in that sense, that, whether you've got the right educational policies, whether governments are focused on learning outcomes or not, all of those things make a difference in terms of whether you can then bring back the skills that had gone overseas and then utilize them in some productive fashion. But chances are that somebody who goes and works on a farm in Australia is probably going to try and figure out how can I use those skills back home. But if land policies don't allow for such things, if fertilizer policy doesn't allow for such things, then it's much more complicated to make that happen. So it's not only about the person coming back and investing in the country. It's also a question of what are the existing surrounding policies that enable that to take place. Let me, if I can take 1 second, just 1 second. I don't want my overview presentation to cloud what has happened over the last 18 months. You just saw from Stephen and Jesse's presentation how in-depth that analysis is. Now, if you take all of those background papers that I was talking about, each one of the papers that is in our background, is in the Pacific Possible, is to that level of detail. There's a serious effort, except for the paper on deep sea mining, there's a serious effort to quantify the impacts, whether it's a cost such as the impacts of non-communicable diseases or climate change impacts, or whether it's a benefit, fisheries, tourism, ICT, etc. There's an effort to quantify the impacts of those policies 25 years from now. What we're not trying to do is we're not trying to give the Pacific region a roadmap on how to get there. It's not an operational guide on how to get there, but it is to say that, look, these are possible areas where you can get tremendous benefits over the next 25 years if you focus on them. We call them transformational, but most of these things are not transformational in the sense that it's not that anybody hasn't thought about them. Everybody's thought about them. We've tried to put numbers to them. The overall Pacific Possible report will try and aggregate some of these numbers to give you a country level impact in 2040. Right? So that's, I'll stop there.
All right, excellent. Well, please join me in thanking our speakers. apologies if we didn't have more time for questions, but if you do have follow-up questions, please just corner them after the next session, which is on renewable energy, and I think we'll begin straight away. Thank you.